In draping, ultimately our goal is to create a pattern from which a garment can be cut. Precision in the preparation of our muslin will give us the most accuracy for this pattern. Each project comes with a muslin preparation diagram to guide you in the sizes of your muslin pieces. First, following the length grain measurements, mark, clip, and tear. Then do the same for the cross grain. Measure, mark, clip, and tear. Also, it's a good idea to remove the selvage edge, as sometimes it will cause the fabric to pucker and pull. Also, I like to make a little arrow on my length or straight grain on the calico or muslin so that I can keep track of my length and cross before I'm ready to mark. Tearing rather than cutting is the most accurate way of ensuring that you're going to be on grain. That means your length or straight grain perfectly perpendicular with your horizontal or cross grain. The fabric will tear along those warp and weft threads, ensuring the most accuracy. After tearing your calico or muslin pieces, the next step is to block them. This means to realign the warp and weft threads into their original configuration, which is perfectly perpendicular. First, draw a right angle on some paper, and then line up your piece. Here you can easily see how it is not forming a right angle. So I'm going to simply stretch and pull my piece until it does form a right angle. I'm actually pulling the warp and weft threads back into alignment. The next step in preparing your muslin is the pressing. Gentle handling and a limited amount of steam is important, as too much steam will cause puckers that won't go away. It's important to press on the length grain and the cross grain, and never on the bias. Pressing on the bias will cause those warp and weft threads to go out of alignment. If you have deeper creases that are not being resolved, you can sponge them. Take a terry washcloth, dip it in water, rub the crease, and press again. Then, check your muslin against your grid marker paper to see that it's still at right angles. Continue to block and press until your piece is perfect. After your muslin or calico pieces have been blocked and gently pressed, it's time to mark your grain lines. To do this, follow your muslin preparation diagram and first, mark the length grain with 2 or 3 marks, and then simply draw a pencil line. For the cross grain, measure again, and then this time, use your right-angled ruler to ensure that those grain lines are perfectly perpendicular. For the bias line, I'm going to start with this intersection and measure 2 equidistant points and then draw that 45-degree angle. Once, and then once again to remind myself that that's the bias. Remember, Draw your lines neatly and only dark enough to just be seen. We don't want to be distracted by dark smudgy pencil lines and unnecessary marks while we're concentrating on contouring the lines of our drape. A second method of marking your grain lines is the thread trace. This method can be used when you're working with the actual fabric that your garment will be made of. First, make sure you've blocked and pressed properly. Note that silks and woolens, such as this piece of wool, have a much more stable grain line and will be easier to block. Then locate your grain line by measuring from one of the torn edges and creating a pin line about every 2 inches or 5 centimeters. Use the entry point of the pin for your line. Now, I like to place a ruler nearby, which will help me keep my lines straight and help keep the fabric from moving. And then I'm going to just stitch the line along my pin line using large stitches. Probably want to go along the full width of your fabric. Make sure that you test your thread for color fastness if you're working on light fabrics. You don't want marks to be left after you remove the threads. A serious study of the effects of the grain lines is well worth your time. They have such a profound effect on the look of your garments. Plus, you'd probably like to understand why we spend so much time in the preparation of the muslins, pressing, blocking, and marking these grain lines. Here, we have 2 pieces of fabric cut on different grains. Here we have the length grain running down the center of the form. You can see how it's creating these really pronounced vertical drapes. Here we have the cross grain running down the center front of the form, and you can see how that strong warp thread running horizontally is pushing the fabric out. You can see how you definitely would not want to put a cross grain across the hip or an area that you want to minimize. Now let's take a look at the bias grain. The bias grain running down the center front of the form creates yet another effect. You can see how the hemline is kind of softly rolling. It's molding a little more gently across the bust. The 45-degree angle of the bias is creating a little give and stretch. It's subtle, especially in a heavier fabric like this, but you can see why it's used a lot for lingerie and evening wear. Train your eye to recognize these grain lines and their effects so that you can work them to your advantage in your draping. Once your muslin is blocked and prepared, you're ready to begin your drape. Initially, you'll be setting your grain lines, which is laying the foundation for the balance and stability of your drape. You must be accurate and precise. A good place to start is at the center front. I'm going to align the length grain of the muslin with the center front of the form. Then pin again a second time at an angle to hold it firmly in place. Then you can continue down the center front, lightly pinning, leaving the ease that's created over the bust in the center. Then gently smooth the muslin over the bust and shoulder area, pin, keeping the cross grain horizontal or parallel to the floor. The warp and weft threads of these grain lines are crucial to the look of your garment, but also for its longevity. If oddly placed grain lines are not supporting each other, they'll tend to twist or sag over time and wear. So just drape with an awareness of these grain lines. You have your marked grain lines to guide you. Now I'm going to demonstrate joining a simple seam. This garment is ready to have the side seams joined. Because I've got the elastic at the waist and I'm anchor pinned here, I can simply join the two seams by lightly creasing the front, holding it over the back, and pinning from the waist to the hem. Allowing the raw edges to go to one side, I'm going to pin horizontally, perpendicular to the seam line, with the point of the pin going right in at the fold. This will help you pin firmly, which is important because you don't want your garment to shift around while you're working. You might be working on gathers or adjoining pieces and you don't want it to be slipping around. You'll need more pins on a smaller, more fitted garment, but here with this long seam, fewer pins will cause less puckering. Pinning accurately and neatly will help eliminate unwanted puckering in your garment so that you can focus on your silhouette and shape. Hemming is the finalization of the proportion of your design. To do that, you can either use a long ruler and lightly chalk. You can use part of the form to mark, such as the rung or the bottom of it, or use a standing hammer. I'm going to mark my hem. And then pin just a few inches, perhaps 8 centimeters. I'm pinning vertically, perpendicular to the seam line, with the pins going in at the raw edge on the outside. And then give yourself a perspective check. A mirror is a really valuable tool to have nearby while you're draping. You can easily see your garment from a distance, what might be missing in your proportion or what you may want to adjust. At this point, if you need to, adjust it a little more. If not, continue pinning. Things like lightly chalking and pinning neatly are really important to be aware of because we want these technical tools to recede so that we can focus on the more artistic side, creating your garment. Now I'm going to show you another pinning technique that's helpful for beginners or for working on more complex garments. Here, we're ready to pin the side seams together. First, I'll determine my volume, check my grain lines, and then pin vertically with wrong sides together and raw edges out. Now I'm ready to turn front over back. Now, it's important not to skip this step. It's very tempting to just drape your whole garment with the raw edges out. However, the great advantage to draping and working in 3D is that you can see your shape as you're working it. You can watch your process and fine-tune and adjust as you go along. So it's important to have these seams on the inside. Now, I'm going to chalk the line and cross mark. Chalk the lines. On both sides at the pin line. I'm going to cross mark also on both sides in the same place so that I can realign the muslin pieces when I unpin them. Now I'm going to unpin and I have my chalk lines and cross marks to help me match back up. Now, the basic rule of thumb is the fewer the pins, the better. However, we want it to be secure enough so that if we need to take the muslin off to add a shoulder pad or more petticoat, that we can easily take it on and off the mannequin. So pin with an awareness of that balance. And remember, beautiful pinning is an art. Clipping and trimming are some of our most basic techniques in draping. If done properly, it will eliminate a lot of the twisting, pulling, and puckering that you may see in your drape. I'm going to demonstrate a few points. As with many garments, as we begin the drape, I'm going to align the length grain of the muslin with the center front of the form. Then smooth across the bust line, keeping the cross grain parallel to the floor. The basic rule of clipping and trimming is that when the muslin begins to be restricted by the form, we need to remove that excess. First, I'm going to trim the neckline excess. Then I can go in and vertically clip along the neckline until it lies smoothly against the form. About a ½ inch, 1.5 centimeters is about right for this proportion. Then I'm just going to secure with pins from front to back. When draping necklines, I like to keep it high so that while I'm working on the drape, I keep the stability of the length and cross grains. Later, when we're working our style lines or deciding the design of the neckline, we can tape or cut away the neckline, but for now, we're going to leave it high. The next step is I'm going to trim the shoulder and armhole area. I've estimated the size that I need, and I'm going to leave plenty of seam allowance. Just want to trim off some of that excess. Don't worry about trimming too much. It's easy to just patch in an extra piece of fabric if you've gone too far, and then you can just continue draping. Now we're going to drape the side bust dart. One of the challenges of women's wear is how to deal with this excess that's created over the bust. Darting is a solution to this, and with the side bust dart, it's an easy solution because the line of the dart will be away from the style of the front. With the side bust dart, we're going to simply take this excess fabric and fold it up to create the dart. We want the fullness to radiate towards the bust line, but keep it off about an inch so that it softens the line. Pin. The deeper the intake, or the amount of fabric that you're removing, the more pointed your dart will become. It's okay to have a little bit of ease in the armhole as well. We want to keep the point of the dart about an inch off of the bust apex, which will allow a little bit of an easier fit and allow for more variety of heights of bust. Note the boxy silhouette this side bust dart creates. Another important point in clipping and trimming is at the point where you've got the side seams pinned together, wrong sides out. Now before you want to turn your seams to the inside, this excess should be removed or it will create bulk inside of your side seam. I've approximated the seam allowance that I'm going to need. And now I'm going to clip any curves. Even though it seems like a very gentle curve, just clipping this much will help the side seam to fall more smoothly. Note how just clipping a little bit more has allowed us to have a smoother side seam, especially at the waistline. The French dart is very similar to the side bust dart, yet angles quite severely down from the bust point to the waist. This allows for a closer fit at the under bust and waist area. We will begin by pinning down the center front as usual, aligning the length grain of the muslin with the center front of the form. Then smooth the muslin over the top of the bust, allowing all of the ease to fall towards the front. Pin across the bust and a little bit at the top of the side seam. And then, as you form your dart, mark lightly with chalk, because we're going to cut out the excess of the dart intake. Leave about 3/4 of an inch or 2 centimeters seam allowance. We also will need to trim at the waist so that we can get that snug fit here. I'm going to clip to the waist and then pin across. Now we can work the French dart. Back it a little bit off the bust apex as we did before. Simply fold, get a smooth line, and start your pinning. Pull out as much as you can here for a nice snug fit. When working with darting, it's important to consider the final look that you're trying to create. Here we're working on a long, slender bateau neck sheath dress, so we're going to choose a long vertical dart to complement that look. Note how we've created a side bust dart and it's pulling in a lot of the fullness here, but we still have quite a bit of ease in the front. That vertical dart will eliminate that ease and create fullness at the bust and hip where we need the room. Now, it's possible that you can angle your dart off grain if that's the style line you wish to create. However, keep in mind that when you start working off grain, you may get some twisting from that. Here, we're going to remain on the length grain with our vertical dart. Begin by folding the dart towards the center and pinning at the waist. I'm going to pin up towards the bust, ending about 1 inch below the apex, or 2.5 centimeters. Then work down the hip, finishing at about the hip line. Check your ease and pin at the side. Now with the back, I've begun by creating a small shoulder dart to accommodate the fullness over the shoulder blade. Then I'm going to create a long vertical dart to shadow the one in the front. However, if I fit it at the waist as much as I want to, I'm getting quite an exaggerated point at the top and the bottom. So it will work better if I create two smaller darts to accommodate that fullness. Here you can see the softer look that's created by the two darts. Traditionally, the one on the outside would be shorter than the one towards the center back. You can see what a nice soft look that creates with accommodating the fullness of the shoulder blade. The taping of the style lines is the important finishing touch to the look and fit of your garment. We're going to work on the neckline and the armhole now. Taking my black sticky tape, I'm going to start at the center back. First, I'm going to start out with the bateau neckline, coming fairly straight around the curve of the shoulder and on the front, keeping the line straight but high enough to clear the hollow of the neck. Then I'm going to work on the armhole, starting at the shoulder, coming down fairly straight, coordinating the look of that with the neckline so that we have our angular look, then scooping out a little more of a curve in the lower part to allow for freedom of movement, and then again fairly straight in the back, ending up with a classic egg-shaped armhole. And there we have the finalized look of the garment. Now that my muslin or toile is finished, it's time to begin the pattern making process. First, we're going to mark the muslin. With a pencil or chalk, I'm going to draw a dotted line on both sides of my pinned edges. Cross mark about every 10 inches or 25 centimeters, or any crucial areas that you need to match up, such as the ends of the darts, waistline, and then mark on the outside of all of your taped style lines. Then, when you're done with that, unpin and press lightly. Then make sure that all of your marks are visible. The truing of your lines means to join the markings that you made in the last step. It's important to use the correct rulers and curves to make your job easier and your pattern more accurate. First, I'm going to use my clear graph ruler to mark the lines that I know are straight edges, such as the shoulder, the center front, which is already marked on my length or straight grain, the darts, going from the point of the dart Note how I straighten the line even though I see a crooked marking, just because I know that it should be straight. Then on my long vertical dart, I'm going to check my points, and if they're a little off, I'm going to try to find the balance between the two of them so that I can keep this dart on grain. So first I'm going to draw the center line, and then again checking that I'm about the same, drawing the dart. Now, using the French curve, I'm going to mark the neckline, the armholes, and the waist and hip. When marking the neckline, I want to first make sure that the first inch is perfectly perpendicular because I have the bateau neckline. Now I'm going to use the French curve to fill in my lines. It's a question of just finding the right part of the curve to fit as I join these up. The other thing that this French curve is really good for is to do the waist to hip curve, which goes from convex to concave. So I'm going to just sort of fill in that little curve. Then, folding my dart up, I'm going to join the cross marks and pin my dart in place to finish this line. Now I can draw the straight line from the waist to the armhole. To continue down the hip, I'm going to use my long hip curve and then to go all the way down to the hem, I'm going to join the two rulers and draw the line all the way down to the hem. Then I'm going to take my small ruler and mark my seam allowances. Now I'm going to move on to the back piece, and with my clear graph ruler, center back neckline, straight line, shoulder, and darts. I'm going to check my points because I would like these to be on grain. I'm going from the waist to the lower points. Again, I'm going to measure from the straight grain. This is not to say that sometimes you won't angle your darts. That's entirely possible. But in this case, since it's a really long angular dress, I would like them to be on grain. Also, as we discussed, the dart closest to the side should be slightly shorter, which is what we have here. Now I'm going to close my shoulder dart and work with my neckline and armhole. And as I do that, I'm going to take my front piece that I've already trued, fold out my seam allowance, and match it up so that I'm coordinating these two lines. Then I can use my French curve, blend, I'm going to blend so that my intersections are smooth, finish my lines, and then continue by adding my seam allowances. Once that's done, I'm going to work on the side seams. Again, repinning my bust dart. I'm going to do my back side seam using the French curve for the waist to hip convex to concave curve. Note here how I have some stray lines, but I'm just going to blend with what I know is a smooth curve, even though some of my marks go in and out. So you can see down here I've got the same type of situation where I've got some stray marks there that I'm just going to smooth out. And now I'm going to check the two side seams together by matching my cross marks. I've got this one here. I've got one at the waist. I'm good. And there's my armhole, a little bit off. So I've got about 1/4 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters difference here between the front and the back. So I'm going to take a happy medium here, and then using my French curve, I'm going to blend the new line here and here, and add my seam allowances. Just to be totally clear, if I have a line that's wrong outside of my finished line, I usually exit out like that. There's my correction. A cross mark there at the dart. And we're ready for the next step, which is to make the pattern. When your muslin or toile is finished and basted together, you're ready for a fitting. It's always helpful to have a fit model, rather than just on your form, to analyze your total look. On a quick scan, my only comment is that I wish it were a little more pegged at the bottom to get a little closer to my look. But first, when doing this specific fitting, I'm going to start at the top and work down. Can you step down? I feel like my bateau neckline is fine, but I feel like the armhole has a little bit of an odd curve, so I'm just going to bring this line a little straighter here and mark it with my red correction tape. That'll also give her a little more room for movement in the front. Also, as we discussed with the shaped dart, it looks like we could pull out a little more at the underbust. So I'm going to pin there. This fullness here actually looks like it's coming from the back and the high hip a little bit. And of course, as we've discussed, it's nice to work with a mirror so you can see what's going on with your 360-degree awareness. I am going to bring that dart down just a little further. Note that I'm only fitting on one side. If I'm working with a symmetrical garment, I can use those measurements to transfer to both sides. Now, if you could step back up again, I'm going to check the sides in the mirror. And then to the front. So it looks like if I pull out 3 inches or 8 centimeters at the bottom, simply fold from the top to get my look. You turn that way just a little bit. Remember that the fewer pins the better to keep the look smooth, so you can see what your silhouette looks like. Okay, other side. Okay, and here again, about a little over 3 inches or 8 centimeters. Just folding it over, lightly creasing, and pinning down. There we go. Maybe a little more at the high hip here. Also keep in mind when you're fitting, whether you're fitting specifically to this model or to a specific size, in which case you can take that into consideration as you're working. In this case, I'm fitting pretty specifically to my model. Okay, shall we walk and see? Good. I think we're pretty close to the look that we want. The next step in preparing your muslin or toile for a fitting can be done in one of 2 ways. Either you can transfer it directly to paper at this point, or you can cut duplicate muslins from the pieces you've got already trued up. Here, on my center front, since I've only got half, I've prepared this piece of muslin on the fold with the same grain lines so that I can simply align my piece with the center front on the fold and cut along my seam allowances. For the inside lines, such as the darts, I'll simply take a piece of tracing paper and mark the dart line or the cross marks. Or, as a second method, I can use my awl and simply punch through all layers which will give me my dart markings. For the back piece, I'll use the same method. Just take another piece of muslin exactly like this one with the same grain lines drawn and simply cut around the piece. Mark the darts and I'm ready to sew the 2 together and fit them on my model. The second method would be to simply transfer my muslin or calico at this point to a paper pattern. To do that, I first prepare my paper by marking the grain line